It is an absolute pleasure to be here with some very dear friends from Brazil. And I hear that you've had a very interesting day talking all manner of things, budgets, civil services, how to fix them, HR, the state of the world, topics that are not so difficult to solve. My name's Debbie Wetzel. I am the Senior Director in charge of governance at the World Bank. So I oversee all of our work in governance, ranging from the traditional classical work on civil service, tax, spending, budgets, through our work on open government and transparency, through our work on anti-corruption, through our work on financial management and procurement. So a whole set of issues that come together in different ways. More importantly, I have had the pleasure of working for the World Bank twice in Brazil, from 2006 to 2009, working with Chico and Jorge as our lead governance person on the ground, and then more recently from 2012 to 2015 as the country director for Brazil, and had lots of fun working with many of the states on their reform programs, whether it was reform-based management, so whether it was Minas or Pernambuco or Rio or Sao Paulo or Amazonas, and lots of interesting lessons, both positive and negative, to be learned, which we can talk about at some point. The topic that we're meant to talk about today with our distinguished panel, also of friends, is capacity building for turbulent times. And as I go to the board of the directors and go around the world, the question I get probably most often is, why can't you just build capacity? Just build it, you're meant to have been doing this forever and it's not built yet. And it's probably one of the thorniest issues that we face as an institution, but also for all of us working on trying to improve public sectors around the world. How is it that we create the systems and incentives? In some sense, many people think it's just a matter of sending in training. And we do that, but it involves a lot of other things. And we have some wonderful colleagues here to tell us a little bit today about their own experiences comparing Brazil and the United States. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction for each and then let them present, and then we'll take rounds of questions. First, we have Fernando Figueres, who's a director of research at ENAPE, the National School of Public Administration. He's the director of research and graduate studies, also a professor of political science at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And he works on lots of areas: corruption in politics and public administration, control of corruption and accountability institutions in democratic context. So we'll have to have a separate conversation on corruption. He's also researching development of mechanisms of transparency and publicity in contemporary democracies. We have with us as well Matthew Taylor, well known for his work on Brazil. He's an associate professor at the American University School of International Service. His research and teaching interests includes state capacity, corruption, judicial politics in Latin America broadly and in Brazil in particular. He's worked recently, or in recent years, at University of Sao Paulo. He was a member of the faculty there from 2006 to 2011. And he's done some really, in addition to his articles, some really interesting books. Judging Policy, Courts and Policy Reform in Democratic Brazil, which is a never-ending topic, I think, as well as we were talking about civil service reform. And also work on the power of corruption and democracy in Brazil, struggle for accountability. Lots of publications in various journals. And then also with us from the OECD, Edwin Lau, who's the head of division, Public Sector Reform, Public Governance, and Territorial Development Directorate. Edwin is the head of the Public Sector Division, and this division helps countries improve the responsiveness of their governments and their relations with citizens and business through work on public sector innovation, e-government, open data, human resources, management and risk management, and he also oversees the work Government at a Glance and the Observatory for Public Sector Innovation. So we go from Brazil, a little bit broader, Brazil, America, to the world. So we have a full set of individuals to help us address this question of capacity building. So Fernando, over to you, about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Fernando Filgueiras. I'm Director for Research and Graduate Studies at ENAP. I present to you a research about the capacities and policy work in Brazilian civil service. This research I coordinate this research, and it have a moment in the last year at in Brazilian civil service. So capacities have a conventional definition. In the perspective of Besley person, for example, state capacities is a institutional capability to carry out various policies that deliver benefits and service to households and firms. State capacities, in this point, are institutional inputs to produce outcomes in policies and services to society. State capacities are a predictor to policy efficiency and effectiveness. E-capacities allow policy delivery. Capacities so that have a problem with definition. Capacities can be individual, organizational, technological, or political, without that the literature have a consensus as to what capacities are and how they should be distributed in the various organizations that compose the government. The analysis of these capacities presupposes structural conditions, considering that administrative and political capacities are explanatory factors for policy performance. So, do organizations have clear goals? State capacities, the discussion about capacities, have a commitment with an organizational perspective. But the concept of state capacities disregards the dimension of action and behavior of individuals within bureaucracies. Bureaucracies are collective actors whose behavior is reflected on state capacities vis-à-vis the organizations of which they are part. We have some theoretical challenge. How much information incentives is enough for individuals to collaborate and improve capacities of governments? How to best allocate individuals according to their competence within organizations? How to identify the multiple balance for management mechanisms between the organization and individuals according to contract and organizational culture. These challenges promote an idea that capacities are no organizational perspective, but we have talked to policy capacities. The concept of policy capacity seeks to observe the resources needed to implement policies in the dimension of individuals and also organizations. Policy capacities must be understood in a more dynamic flow and process than as a stock that works as a predictor of good public policy. more than the objectives of organizations and the stock of bureaucratic capacities, it is necessary to understand the dynamics of agents in institutional context. This is a challenge of comprehend the state capacities and capacity building in government. Building capabilities and policy work. The policy work approach starts from the observation of the field and not from prescriptive models. It addresses policy styles and the set of attitudes and tasks performed by bureaucratic agents so that the production of results in public policies depends on more complex bureaucracy. Policy work is the set of activities disbursed by bureaucrats who bring together attitudes, tasks, and abstract word conceptions that specify the dynamics of policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation. The policy works bring together a perspective about the state capacities, and we have to comprehend the join the concepts of capacities and policy work to comprehend more nuanced and more flow perspective about the public service and policy work. This is analytical framework of the research. In my perspective, the capacities are administrative capacities and relational capacities. Capacities have two dimensions: analytical, managerial, in the case of the administrative capacities, and internal coordination in politics about the relational capacities. The perspective of these capacities is have outcome as efficiency, efficacy, agents and legitimacy of public policies and public services delivered to society. The analytical framework is used in a research, a survey research of Brazilian civil service realized by some premises. First, the framework present above brings together a complex set of activities aimed to understand the dynamic capabilities of bureaucracy in the form of policy work. Capacities do not represent a rational organization of governments, but a collection of individuals who perform functions and activities in a context of bounded rationality and undefined goals. Third, the degree to which these skills and competence are mobilized or not can impact the policies in varied way. Fourth, policy workers may be oriented toward formal strategies to implementation, such as a managerial strategy. However, they adapt and adjust the implementation of policies, adjusting the process in the field of practice. In Brazilian civil service, are composed to public servants that are under merit-based system, which provides some level of standard regulations and procedures regarding servant selection, appointment, and discretionarity. And to sum up, for the purpose of this research, civil service is concerned with the civil servants that work in the federal executive branch are under merit-based system, resulting more permanent and directly involved body in the public policy production. The methodology is a survey research applied in 25 agents, ministries, and regulatory agents. The survey was hosted by an online platform, and it was sent by email directly to the professionals, and data collection took place from October to December 2017. The sample is composed to 2,000 response of Brazilian civil servants of executive branch in federal government. What defines of the research? What policy workers do in Brazil? In relation to the time of performance in public policy, they are experienced. 34% have been working for more than 10 years in the same policy. The primary functions informed by respondents were related to operationalization of policy instruments, delivery of frontline services, and project management. Analytical and formulation functions, which were discussed in the form sections, appearing only in 8% and 80.80% respectively. Moreover, relational functions such as interactions within the state apparatus and with external actors are the least performant activities. So, the result is heterogeneous portrait of policy work in Brazil. Managerial and administrative tasks are the ones performed more frequently. 62% said that always or frequently produce material to support decision making. 47% said that the people that they operate database informational systems with the same frequency. 35% of respondents said that they always or frequently work to meet accountability agents' recommendations. Relational tasks seem to be performed by a more restricted group of individuals. And finally, tasks that seem to demand specific expertise, such as to create legislation and to prospect funds, are never or rarely performed by most of the respondents. This is a factorial analysis on policy work in Brazil. Basically, we have 4 groups of no problem about the policy work: relational tasks, analytical oversee tasks, managerial tasks, and administrative tasks. Defines analytical capacity of the Brazilian civil service is mostly aimed at attaining accountability demands, not prioritizing policy production or policy development. Internal coordination and political relational capacities are held by the same group of individuals. There is, in fact, a group dedicated to managerial tasks, which is distinct from the group responsible for more operational activities. The policy functions performed by the Brazilian civil service vary according to each of the components and each of the policy areas. So, what are the challenges about the building capacities in Brazil? First, capacity building in the public service cannot be understood only as a set of organizations that fulfill delegated goals for the realization of public policies. Capacity building in policy work. Policies depend on a set of actions performed by individuals who carry within them different individual capacities, which are brought together in a complex set of organizations which demand commitment and motivation to achieve their ends. Public policy functions fulfill the role of complex activities that comprise a complex and highly differentiated map that cannot be interpreted only within the scope of organizational objectives. And the functions that are performed by public managers compose a complex framework that can explain the performance of policies. And this demonstrates that the concepts of capabilities should not only focus on a macro or conception of organizations, but on more nuanced concept of capacity, which is associated with the concept of policy work. Aqui, this nuanced can make reforms better understand performance of functions and cover the institutional and managerial incentives for the realization of policy work. And also, it can serve to understand eventual management failures in a more realistic way, include specific policy domains. Finally, capacities are dynamic aggregates of policy work with the goal of delivering public policies and services to society. And capacities can be predictors of results, but they need to be dealt with in a dynamic and contingent way, taking into consideration organizational and political demands. Thanks a lot.
Okay, obrigada. So you bring out a few points about how there's one question, which is capacity for what? Yeah. So relational capacity, analytic, managerial. But I think also very important, and what Fernando puts in front of us, is the point that we often think about governments as organizations, but those organizations are composed of individuals. And individuals have their own set of incentives within organizations. And how incentives frame what they do and how they do it is a dynamic process that we need to think about. And I think there's work going on in other places. It'll be interesting to come back to that question once we've heard from some of our other speakers. So, Matthew, over to you.
My good friend Fernando and I work on similar topics. We've been working on similar topics for a decade now, and we usually disagree, which is fun. We're going to disagree on capacity, or to put it a different way, we define capacity in a different way, and you have a much more holistic view of capacity, which is good. I'm going to present a fairly narrow view of capacity, but try to show a little bit why it matters. The work I'm presenting is co-authored with Kate Bursch, Sergio Prasa, it's a series of papers, so I'm trying to summarize a number of different ideas here. And I've thrown in, for good measure, a little bit of comparison with the United States at the end. Before I start, thank you very much to Francisco Gaetani and to Paulo Sotero, as always. It's wonderful to be here. So the literature on Brazil has emphasized the importance of the capacity and autonomy of the Brazilian state. One of our previous speakers talked about Evan's work on capacity and autonomy. And there's a lot of literature on the idea that there are islands of excellence within the Brazilian state, and sort of islands of excellence within a sea of patronage and clientelism. Most of that literature is referring to the period from 1945 to 64, not really to the present, but there's nonetheless a sort of a continuing view about the way that the Brazilian state is structured. And this is perhaps best summarized by Barbara Geddes' work, where she talks about the politician's dilemma. And so as you look at Brazil, as we've already mentioned, is a system, it's a political system that has more than 25 parties represented in Congress at any given time. And presidents who come into office face just a terrible dilemma of how do they pull the coalition together but also get things done. And so Barbara Geddes had a very interesting insight, which was that they kind of trade off. They're willing to give some ministries, some agencies to particular parties and sort of let them do what they want to do. And then they keep a kitchen cabinet, usually of economic policy ministries that they work on, that they try to maintain as islands of excellence to get things done. So with my co-authors, we decided to look at what is actually going on in contemporary Brazil. The data I'm going to present today is largely from 2011, so it's pre-impeachment, but I'll show you at the end a little bit of data from later on. The database is of 325,000 federal civil servants. And we have two data sources. One is Ministério do Planejamento, the planning ministry, and then we also have data from the electoral courts. And we're able to cross that data to get measures of what we roughly term capacity, and then a measure of what we roughly term political autonomy. And we aggregate this up through latent variable analysis to look at the 95 most significant federal agencies. So just to give you an idea of these measures, I won't spend a lot of time on this page, but our idea of capacity is really an instrumentalization of the notion of esprit de corps. What keeps a bureaucracy running? It's esprit de corps. It's this ability to work together. Sometimes that's created through meritocratic recruitment, but oftentimes it's also created through rewarding, long-standing careers, predictable careers that last over time. And so we have a measure here that's based on career strength, career specialization, the requisitioning of civil servants from other agencies, and salaries. And then we have a measure of autonomy. And for those of you who are not acquainted with Brazil, Brazil has political appointee positions. There are low-level DAS positions, and there are high-level DAS positions. Today, most of the low-level DAS positions are actually filled by civil servants, but they are nonetheless political appointments at heart. I won't talk about this, but I'm willing to come back to it. This is how we aggregate the variables. And here you can see the 95 agencies distributed on the two axes here of capacity and autonomy. And again, these are 2011 data. And if you look at the upper right-hand quadrant there, the one at the top of the page on the right, you'll see what has been termed islands of excellence. And so you see up there, BCB is the Brazilian Central Bank, the MRE is Itamaraty, the Foreign Ministry, CGU is up there, the Comptroller General, FAZ is the Finance Ministry, and then in orange there you can see sort of the averages for agencies across different areas. The lower left-hand quadrant there has the agencies that are, as one of my Brazilian colleagues calls them, ilhas, not de excelência, mas ilhas de excrescência. And so these are laggards, is I guess the delicate way to put it. And what you'll notice there is that this is agencies largely in infrastructure, development, to a certain degree, tourism, sports, culture. And then there are two quadrants which Barbara Geddes didn't really talk about, but a mixture of relatively high capacity with very low autonomy, and then also high autonomy but low capacity. And I guess in that latter category, I won't talk much about the lower right-hand quadrant, but the best example that comes out of the lower right-hand quadrant is the Public Defender's Office. And so for anybody who knows anything about public defenders, nobody wants to be a public defender, right? If you're, most budding lawyers want to be prosecutors or judges or corporate lawyers, and public defenders' offices, in addition, are usually very poorly funded. And so this contributes, we would say, to lower esprit de corps, and that's why we think that they're probably down there in that lower right-hand quadrant. So I've given you two variables to think about. Now let me give you a third variable, which is partisan dominance. And so remembering here that Brazil has a multi-party system with multiple parties, it's really important to know something about whether ministries are given over entirely to a single party, porteira fechada, as they call it in Brazil, or whether those ministries are divided and subdivided among parties. And so across the sample that we're looking at, this is sort of the triangle of the bureaucracy for each agency. And partisan dominance is looking at the percentage of employees that are affiliated to the top party in that agency. So if the PMDB is the top party, they're the dominant party, and we're looking at their members. And what's nice about this variable is it's not highly correlated to capacity and autonomy. So just to show you, I want to show you some examples. What I've done here in this graph is just put the partisan dominance data on top of the capacity and autonomy data. And so you can see this is by quartile. And I'll just pull out a few of the agencies that are of interest here and that I think exhibit the importance of partisan dominance. So this first agency is DENOX. DENOX is an agency that works on drought relief, and it operates in 27 states, but primarily in the Northeast. And so it's not surprising to see that this is an agency that has very low autonomy. What's kind of interesting is if you look at the blue inside the triangle there, the blue is the number of partisans, but the red is the partisan dominant party. Okay, so this is an agency which has fairly high partisanship, but there's not much of a dominant party. Here's a second one, the CGU. This is the Ministry of Transparency as it's known today. And it's an interesting agency. It doesn't have much partisanship. It's not as partisan. Many of its staff were borrowed from the Planning Ministry and from the Finance Ministry. And you can see that partisanship and partisan dominance are fairly low. This next one is the Highway Police. And the Highway Police is another example of an agency. It's in 27 different states. You can imagine that there are a lot of governors who would like to control appointments within the Highway Police. But what's very interesting is because the 27 states are divided amongst different parties, no party has a very strong hold or grip on the Highway Police. So there's a lot of politicization, but not a lot of partisan dominance. And then this is, the last one is agrarian development. And agrarian development, for those of you who remember the Rousseff, well, Lula and Rousseff administrations, when Lula first came into office, he decided to give the agriculture ministry to, I forget what party he is, Rodriguez. Anyway, kind of a mainstream politician. And the PT, many stalwarts of the landless workers movement who had been very supportive of the PT were really bothered by this. And one of the compensatory mechanisms was creating agrarian development. And what's interesting about agrarian development, as you can see by the red stripe down the middle there, is it's very partisan and it's very PT. Okay, so in 2011. So why does this matter? Well, we wanted to look at why this might matter. One of the best indicators that we could apply across the whole of government was media mentions of corruption. And this is a strategy that's been used by economists and political scientists elsewhere, most notably by Glaser at Harvard. And so thinking about governance here, we put together a database of a decade's worth of corruption stories by agency. And cutting to the chase here, what we find is that our core variables, these three variables, are associated with higher levels of corruption at a statistically significant level. So partisan dominance raises the level of reported corruption, but it does so through the mediation of capacity and autonomy. So if you have a high capacity agency, even if there's partisan dominance, it tends not to feed through as strongly to corruption. And the fewer the political employees there are, the less reported corruption across our sample. Of course, the fewer political employees there are, the less the reported corruption, but a strongly dominant party increases the reported corruption. So just sort of wrapping up quickly here, I think that this is, we see these papers as, in essence, a proof of concept about the utility of trying to measure in an objective way. So remember here, we're building up, our measure here is built from the individual civil servant, data about the individual civil servant up into the aggregate agency measure. And this has some benefits in relation to what's been done in past work, including by Evans himself, who I respect greatly, in the sense that it's much less subjective. And so it gives us a complementary measure to go with surveys that have been done elsewhere. It's also nice because it gives us a within-country measure across agencies. And this has not, to our knowledge, been done widely in an objective way. So I've kind of gone through the levels of politicization. Let me just talk quickly about the two next steps, and I'm going to wrap up because I'm getting ugly signals here. Very nicely sent. So the next steps are really longitudinal and cross-national. And so here we have this sort of measure that we think is useful for thinking about how esprit de corps is created in the state. how does it change over time? And so if you're looking at Brazil, for example, you may be wondering, what has happened under the Temer administration? And so here you can see our data. This is just the autonomy variable. Here we've aggregated the autonomy variable by policy area, and you can see, using this heat map, you can see which areas are getting more autonomous and which are getting less autonomous. And so at the top, you can see foreign policy has stayed more or less constant at a fairly high level of autonomy. Agriculture, although it's getting better, has stayed at a fairly low level of autonomy. But we hope that we'll be able to track this over time in Brazil. And the availability of this data set means that it's a very low-cost way of accompanying both capacity and autonomy in the Brazilian state. The second effort, and this is much, much harder, is trying to do some cross-national evaluation here. And so I realize that this may be very hard to read, but what you have is, on the left, Brazil, and on the right, the United States. And all we're measuring here, this is not our measure of autonomy because it was impossible to make a parallel measure, but all we're measuring here is the number of appointees over the total number of employees in an agency or ministry in the two countries. And if you look, the solid bar there that runs horizontally is the average across all of these agencies. And you can see here that there are fewer political appointees in the United States than there are in Brazil. The regression lines that are running, sloping downward, green and blue there, regress appointments against capacity for all of these agencies. And the red lines provide the same calculation, but all we've done here is look at cabinet ministries, only for cabinet ministries. And so, again here, I think that this can tell us something about how political appointments change the nature of government provision. There are good reasons to have political appointees, but there may be some sweet spot between having enough to control the government and not so many that you actually distort policy perspectives. And the comparison of the two countries, I would argue, suggests that appointees may be serving the control function more in the United States than perhaps in Brazil, where we know that there's this coalitional pressure. So, thank you all very much.
All right, Matthew, thank you so much. So this notion of capacity as esprit de corps, I love the picking apart of the different agencies and ministries. As you continue the work, I'd be very interested to know whether you've done anything about federal versus subnational too, because that also, this question of capacity is at all the different levels. And so how this plays out, this is just one level in both countries where there's lots of different roles and responsibilities. But fascinating work in terms of looking at what is where. This notion of esprit de corps and the ability to work together, I think, is quite important. But then the question of how the partisanship feeds into that or not is obviously very interesting. So we'll come back to that as well. Edwin, over to you.
Thank you, Debbie. So right now, my team is actually in Brasilia doing two reviews, one looking at innovation competencies and leadership, and the other looking at the overall public sector innovation system in Brazil. So when I got the call from Gaetani saying, can you come and talk about your observations of Brazil, I said, darn it, if I just come a couple weeks later, I would have a lot more to say. But the last time we really drilled into the Brazilian civil service was in 2010. And so I was thinking about what we did then also with Gaetani and what we're doing now. I realized that the OECD itself has taken a change in its approach to how we build administrative capacity. And so I thought sharing that with you would be a bit interesting, but also looking at where we're coming from in terms of what we've seen in the Brazilian context. So this is data that's collected. It's by the Iberian Civil Service Partnership. It was done with the IDB, looking at civil service reform practices. And so I think, while these types of indicators don't tell the whole story, they certainly tell an interesting story, because between 2004 and 2015, over a 10-year period when this was reviewed, while Brazil had much more frequency of these common civil service management practices, you can see it did not change at all. Now, I think that some of the previous presentations that we heard gave us a good picture as to why that can be. In some cases, there was a lack of reforms. In other cases, it was reforms canceling one another out. But really, it shows a bit of a stasis in terms of the tools that could be used to improve administrative capacity. At the same time, however, often when you take this type of an approach, and I think Dustin mentioned it as well in his presentation, it's kind of a recipe book. If you do this, and you do this, and you do this, then you're going to have improved capacity. When in fact, we understand that many of these things cancel each other out. Civil servants or even politicians often pick and choose, so they cherry pick the things that they like to do. We often find that they're all very interested in senior civil service reforms because they're thinking about their own career paths, less interested in some of the other things such as performance management. So how can we think about these different sets of reforms in ways which provide a much better overall value proposition? So looking at this review that we did in 2010 of the civil service system, we saw three themes, and I'm not going to dwell on these too long because many of the other previous speakers talked about them, but thinking about what are the main attributes or characteristics that we're trying to get out of the civil service. So the first is that in Brazil, we have a career system which is highly fragmented, many different types of job categories, which in the end leads to a certain lack of mobility across the different areas. And so I think if you look at other countries, often we think of the position versus a career system as two sort of ends of an extreme. And in fact, in reality, everyone has sort of a mixed system. They're increasingly hybrid. But when you look at the Brazilian career system, in fact, you get the worst of all worlds because you have a system which normally is promoting strong public sector values, is promoting this kind of cross-cutting concept in the ideal, of course, of what the civil service is trying to achieve. And in fact, you have people that are in little stovepipes and not talking to one another and not moving around in different areas. So one of the sort of ideal or systems in terms of a career system would be the French system, where they have both mandatory mobility across different parts of the government, but they also have what is called the gestion provisionnelle des effectifs, des emplois et des compétences. And what this is a workforce planning system which provides guidelines for cross-cutting analysis of both what the needs of each department are and also how they're going to fill those future needs. So the analysis is actually done by each individual department following guidance that's provided by the DGMAP or DGFP, in any case. But you have a central HR ministry that is not doing this command and control, but rather trying to start a conversation and helping the different ministries think about what their future needs are going to be, where the current gaps are in terms of the competencies, and also where their leadership needs are going to be moving into the future. So both combining an analysis of current needs, but also of future needs. The next step that the French have done now is they've moved from this initial kind of analysis to provide a data-driven discussion about performance to group discussions where they can think about how they can place individuals, manage careers, so that they can develop a more full view of both the skills of the individual, but also of their understanding of the overall needs of the civil service. Second area is we talked a lot about meritocracy and how we can have a better rationalized performance system. We know that the current system in Brazil is quite expensive, fairly opaque. But what didn't come up was the original discussion that we had that you have a rapidly aging population. And so there's a great opportunity here if those changes are made. We understand that they're acquired rights which cannot be changed, but as soon as those people leave, now is the time to step in and put in place a system which is perhaps more rationalized and a bit more transparent. One approach to this would be the New Zealand approach, where rather than having a single compensation system for the government as a whole, the government sets out what they call a principles for remuneration, where each different department, using an analysis of both the labor force and skill shortages and their specific needs, they can set the wages, but wherever they want to make special exceptions, for example, with regard to special entitlements or benefits or leave conditions, those have to be approved by the center. So it's this flexible system where you're taking both into account sectoral needs as well as some central guidance, and they're also trying to promote a discussion about what is the right approach for compensation. With regard to performance management, I think Dustin certainly provides a very good example of how it's done in the United States. But I think that the performance system also needs to be adapted to the capacity of the system to be able to both measure and develop data with regard to its performance objectives. So I think some of the kind of lighter touch systems are also quite interesting. If you look at the Finnish system, for example, they provide performance bonuses that are based both on individual annual objectives, but also on multi-annual objectives. So this way they can cover both things which are very direct and deliverable and measurable, but they can also use those objectives as a lever for people to think about teamwork, so they have collective benefit bonuses, as well as more strategic long-term objectives as a way of changing the incentives and not just thinking in terms of what short-term objectives they can reach. Then looking at overall HR capacity, I think one of the challenges that we see across all OECD countries is how do we move the HR function from a transactional function to a strategic function? Over time, the budget has taken over, and of course we understand in terms of fiscal sustainability, but in the face of that, we also need to think about how we can have a high-performing civil service that can optimize its delivery within that budget envelope. And so part of that is thinking not just in terms of people as costs, but people also as an investment center. And so that involves building the capacity for HR management in each of the individual ministries, and also about what type of leadership we want to develop across the civil service as a whole. So two examples of this are in Chile, the National Civil Service Directorate. They are working with each of the individual ministries to develop guidelines, toolkits, management practices. And so when people ask me, should we have a more decentralized system? Should we have a more centralized system? A lot of it depends on whether or not you also put in place those capacities to be able to make good strategic decisions, both in terms of managerial, in terms of pay, in terms of performance management at the ministry level. If you don't build up that strategic capacity in HR, then it doesn't make any sense to decentralize. In terms of the senior executive leadership in Australia, they have, what do they call it? The Senior Executive Leadership Competency Framework. And what this looks at is, what are the common values across the civil service that we want to promote? What are the levers that we are going to use to promote that? What are the principles that we want people to uphold as civil servants? And I think that one of the discussions, it's been sort of in the background. We've been talking a lot about culture, but how do you change culture? Culture is very difficult to change. Unless you really think explicitly about what are the values as a civil service that you want to uphold. And those values, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, the very base value is your pay. It's your basic needs. But people don't just go to the office to do basic, to get their paycheck. They're also there, at the very top of the pyramid is self-actualization. They're there because somehow their own individual values are aligned with the values of the organization. And that's something that I think that different people surveys and engagement surveys are trying to capture. And I think the approach that the United States is taking in terms of getting this more fine-grained analysis of what motivates people, why do they come to the office, and what is going to get them to go the extra mile, that is going to be much more powerful in terms of changing behavior than any type of contractual relationship that says, if you fulfill, 5 out of 5, then you get an extra bonus. So, but getting to there takes a lot of time. It's not something that's easy. We're talking about shifting the entire culture of a civil service, and there's going to be many people that are extremely cynical. There are going to be many vested interests that you're trying to overcome. So what we're doing is not just putting in place, a bunch of individual reforms, but thinking about how these contribute to a system as a whole. So the OECD is working on a recommendation now. We work on soft law, and that soft law allows us to think about what is the direction of the civil service that makes it fit for purpose in the 21st century, with all the technological changes, with all the complexity that we're trying to face. And here you see there are 3 pillars. One is about a values-driven culture of leadership. What is the statement of values? How do you develop that consensus? How do you involve civil servants in deciding what those values are? How do you align your leadership with that? And how do you have a forward-looking civil service that is thinking not just about delivery of today's needs, but also anticipating what the future needs are? In the middle is we're looking at how do you have a capable and trusted civil service, which is about skills and competencies, but also about what are the different tools that we can have that can bring people into the civil service and make them motivated to give of their best. And then finally, how do we have an agile and adaptive civil service? This is about the institutions, the planning, the mobility, and also very importantly, the terms and conditions. And that's the part that often we don't like to talk about so much. But in fact, what we're seeing is that governments are already doing hacks of their civil service. They're already doing the workarounds. Dustin gave some numbers in his presentation. When we look at intermediate consumption numbers and national accounts at the OECD, we see that there's this, it's just skyrocketing in terms of the number of outsourcing and contracts that governments are using. And so we don't really have a deep understanding of what's going on there. But if we don't have a more principle-based approach to public sector employment, that will continue. You'll continue to have this disparate mix of public and private systems working side by side. In some cases that can work, but we've already seen how oftentimes this leads to a lot of culture clashes and certainly to a lot of mismatch in terms of the management systems. So trying to pull this all together, as I mentioned, my team is in Brasilia right now, and we're doing an exercise that we already did once with the Chilean civil service, and that is looking at what are the new competencies that can cut across all of the civil service. Because if we have this expertise-based model, then people, engineers can only work in, infrastructure ministry, or, teachers can only work in an education ministry. Whereas if you can have a statement of what are those competencies that cut across, then you can start developing them so that people can have both expertise and professional skills, but also cross-cutting competencies. And I like this model very much because what it's saying is, we've talked a bit about data literacy already. We know that with all of this data, we need people who can make sense of that. But if you cut across it down to the bottom left-hand side, you have storytelling. So not only do you need people who understand the data, but you need people who can communicate that data and can have a narrative around it that they can communicate to politicians, but also to civil servants. If you look on the top, we have, or on the bottom, we have curiosity. That's kind of natural, but actually it's not so natural. When you step into a civil service, you're not necessarily being hired for your curiosity. But that natural curiosity oftentimes gets sort of trampled on and stepped aside. Within a year, you often see it. But what you tie that to is iteration. Do people have the ability to experiment? Do they have the ability to set criteria and then to adjust their behavior based on the results of that? So here, once again, we're tying it to more scientific methods, which can allow us to have greater agility and flexibility. And then my favorite, I know that insurgency has a certain meaning in Latin America. But what we're talking about is not revolution. What we're talking about is the willingness of people to question common wisdom. Because if you don't question common wisdom, then you just get stuck with the status quo. And you can link that to user centricity. So we haven't talked that much about the citizens today. How do we bring citizens back into this conversation? Not only do we want to serve them, but we want to have a partnership between citizens and civil servants. And so insurgency there means not just questioning everything, but questioning things when they are not serving citizens, when they are not organized around citizen needs. So when you bring these competencies together, that gives you a framework for rethinking what types of civil servants you want to be bringing into the civil service and how you want to train them in order to have a more innovative and forward-looking approach. And then finally, just to close, I've talked a bit about abilities and skills. But if you look at this framework, we also want to think about what the opportunities are. How do we allow civil servants to use those skills? Because oftentimes we know that the greatest demotivating factor is when people have skills, but they're not given the opportunity to use them. So we talked a bit about the deregulation of the civil service. That's one part of it. But it's also about creating, like as I was talking about, this workforce management, which allows people to move into jobs or have a career path, which helps them to develop the different skills and to use them. And then finally, the motivation is, I don't have glasses, so I
I
can't
want
see.
to innovate, I want to innovate accountability, incentives, and feedback.
Thank you. So this is in part about the feedback, and I think that the performance systems and the engagement surveys are a way of providing us with that feedback to understand whether or not people are engaged with their work. But it's also about the accountability and the ex post evaluation. But really, I don't think we should be measuring ourselves in terms of how many people we fire because of lack of performance. We really should be thinking about how we have a system which maintains them in the zone of performance. So all of this is thinking about how these different reforms that we've been talking about link back to actual motivation, values, and the willingness to perform, which is about changing the culture of the civil service. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much. So, very interesting and additional perspective that looks at some of these traditional tools and levers that we have always used to try to drive the civil service and how and if it works effectively. Question about shifting cultures, these new competencies and the values within. So I'm only going to ask one question, but it's a big, big ticket question before we turn to the audience. And I'm going to try to tie a little bit to the previous session, what we heard at the end there. And so what we see happening in the world is a pretty fundamental shift between around trust and this notion of whether people trust vertical structures versus their ability to trust horizontally, so what you might call distributed trust. So through social media and through technology, there are now ways for society to coordinate that they didn't have before. And so you look at distributed ledger technologies, blockchain, all of these things that mean that sometimes you don't need a vertical structure anymore. And in some way, vertical structures, government as we know it, seems outdated, untrusted. All the corruption feeds into this, whether it's deliberately or not. And so one of the things we're thinking a lot about and struggling with at the bank is as we engage with clients, and this comes back to the previous session, this fourth industrial revolution, what civil service, what capacities are we even thinking about in terms of what is needed? So each of you presented a slightly different perspective on what capacity is and how we get there, whether it's the relational stuff and the ability to interact with policy, whether it's developing an esprit de corps, or whether it's the ability to use levers and think ahead. And Ed, you came close towards the, in your discussion at the end of some of these tools of thinking in different ways. But there is a big, big ticket issue out there in terms of not only is it just regular downsizing because civil services are aging, but there is a question of what is going to be needed for the civil service of the future, given that many things may be able to be done and society may want to do them differently, and how private sector, horizontal public coordination of citizens happens in a way that cuts out the government altogether. So, given your perspectives on capacity, any reflections on that big ticket question? I'm looking for pearls of wisdom to feed into World Bank thinking, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the group. Any thoughts?
I can start. This is already happening. In Switzerland, they have a television redevance, which is a television tax, and they collect it from each individual. And so there's actually a young person's movement which says, we don't watch TV. We use screens. So why should we be paying this old monopoly that's developing content that we don't even use? So you can already see this sort of backlash where people are saying, if you're not relevant to my daily needs, then just get away. I don't need you. And so that may be happening faster or slower in different countries, but that ability to be relevant to the civil service, I think that needs to be our burning platform. It needs to be the reason why we need to change the civil service, because I think there's a certain complacency, like, oh well, we can wait another couple of years.
Forever, and we'll exist.
We've been like this forever, So I think, in part, that's part of is finding that motivation. In part, it's also that when we try to use the civil servants as partners of government, we're trying to break down that distrust. We're trying to create something, and I think, in fact, that's a necessary step to build the trust between the civil servants themselves and the citizens. So this is really about building that trust relationship, and we've done some work on measuring trust. You sort of know where that came from, but in part, that's about the quality of the delivery, so sort of value for money. But in part, it's also about what we call the ability of the civil service, the responsiveness. So the ability of the civil service to anticipate what the next level of needs are. So that fits in very well with the fourth industrial revolution. And then the third part, which was a bit more of a surprise to us, was the values by which the services are delivered. So citizens are actually assessing the civil service. Is there fairness? Is there equality? Is there integrity by which these? So it makes a difference who's delivering the service. It makes a difference, not just are they doing it with a smile, but is there authenticity in that delivery? So I think breaking down these walls is part of it. That means changing the relationship, so it's no longer a hierarchical relationship. So rather than saying, okay, I'm going to build a portal and you must come to that portal, that's the only way you can provide your opinion, is civil servants now going to where people congregate, going to their websites, engaging in communication with them. So it's a bit of humility. You might say, oh, it's just window dressing, but in fact, I think that's part of living your values. And then I think this use of new technology, we're still trying to get a handle on it, but what we're seeing is, for example, when we look at how civil servants use Twitter, and so I'm not talking about politicians, but civil servants themselves, those who use it just to send out messages, like announcements, they actually have fewer followers than those who are using it to engage in a relationship with the civil servant. So the more back and forth exchange you have, even when you don't have anything particular interesting to say, then you're putting a human face. So all of these things are really changing the modus operandi of the civil service. So it's not just when you need something or just when you have, it's getting less transactional and more relational.
And that's a totally different capacity, right?
Very
From
different.
being the civil servant, the expert behind the wall who knows everything. Matthew, you want to? Go ahead, Fernando.
Okay. My opinion is complementary to Edwin. In my opinion, the civil servants must the development of analytical capacities. Analytical capacities that improve a work to new technologies, data literacy, and a capacities to anticipate the society, anticipate the public opinion, anticipate the new technologies as Twitter, Facebook, or other social medias that improve information, that improve data, that improve capacity to work with databases, new informations, big data, that create a basis to improve capacities to lead with a society with more information and more distrust. Distrust is an attitude that people have more education skills, a more critical perspective about the government and public services. So public service must lead with a new information perspective. Improve analytical capacities that to improve the capacities of the state, the capacities of organizations, the capacities of the public service to lead a new problems of information society.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting because whether you like Bolsa Familia or not, people have different views on it. One of the most interesting things about the success of the program was when they decided to go out and seek the poor, as opposed to having them come to the municipality to register and get the card. And in the evaluative work that we did of that program, it was absolutely fundamental that the government went to them everywhere. So that's the beginning of that type of thing. But this question of relevance and accessibility. Matthew?
So I come at this as a dusty academic, and I've been struck by the conversation today, just because there's just a lot of innovation and discussion of big data and how things are changing, and I was also struck by Edwin's point about Maslow's hierarchy, and I wonder if this is a brainstorm, a complete off-the-cuff comment, which is a bad thing to do, but I think that we might think a little bit about a hierarchy of needs in the civil service, because I think as the dusty academic, I'm struck that everybody seems to think change is on its way, and I think it is, but I don't think change is going to be as significant as we think it is. And I think at the basic level of civil servant needs, you still need some predictability. You need salary predictability, you need tenure predictability, you need some idea of esprit de corps in working with people so that you actually go out and deliver the right things. But then I think what you've pointed out is, both of you have pointed out, is as you move up, we need to, the hierarchy, you need to be thinking a lot about skills and how you build those, and then motivation at the top. And I think that's a very effective way of thinking about it, but I would encourage us not to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Sure. Good point. So no babies out with the bathwater. Okay, let's open it up to questions. Anyone? Chico.
The first question, the two questions, one for Fernando, the other for Edwin. Fernando, I'd like to agree with your text, but I have one problem. It's counterintuitive, but I think that the wave of the human factor in the capacity debate is a little bit overrated. It's declining. There are capacities that are not human anymore. The technological dimension is growing its participation. So I don't know hot capacities, cold capacities, how we can, but I suggest that maybe pay attention to the non-human capacities in the debate about, I agree as predicted, but I think that the concept can be expanded. The second point about Edwin, about the OECD framework that we have discussed it recently, and it's happening this week, the field team. I'm afraid that sometimes I don't know if the English, the meaning is the same, but we idealize civil servants. We want an ideal type, a samurai. Samurais don't exist, at least in the civil service. I'm saying this because it's a word in favor of the debate, the old debate about specialization, generalists, specialists, generalists, specialists. I didn't get rid of this debate yet, but I think that at least it's more tractable, touchable, because if we idealize, take insurgents, they're killed everywhere, especially in the bureaucracy. And finally, it's not for you, but for Debbie. There was IBM called a competition for some scientific ideas about the future of government recently. I began to write, but I didn't send it. I would bet in platform, government through platforms. And the combination of the human and the technological, the blend, because it has to be multidimensional. Government can exclude the others. They can't, by definition, you can't leave some people behind. But at the same time, you have to catch up. So we are now, the Minister of Planning has launched some dashboards, really amazing. And it's happening independently of all the other problems. But on the other hand, we have the 19th century problems also. Fernando coordinated research about the interface between citizens and the federal government. I thought that there were 5, 6. They found 1,300. So I like just to conclude, say that we don't know our government. It's so heterogeneous. It's so nuanced. And you can't, where can I read about the government? You know barely where the places you worked or the places that your friends work. So it's the legend about the elephant, the blind people touching the elephant. What's the shape of the animal? That's it.
Okay, any others? Or shall we go through Chico's? Okay, Fernando, you want to start on the weight of the human factor?
Okay. Analytical capacities is conditions to improve information technologies, improve conditions to that public service have more information about policies, about the process, about the outcomes of policies. The analytical capacities can improve a new perspective about the public service. And the analytical capacities is a meeting of human and no human perspective about the public service. The use of technologies, the extension of the use of technologies, the data literacy is a very important. In my opinion, is main important comprehend what policy workers do with technologies and information and create analytical capacities, then a disposal of technologies without human perspective. Technology is a very important. Electronic government, for example, is a very important in interaction, citizens, public servants, citizens, a public service. But the use of technologies depend the human factor and create analytical capacities is very important to improve better policies and better services.
Okay. Edwin, you want to? Are you idealizing insurgency too much?
So I actually we've thought about this. So at a micro level, we actually do personas. Personas. So we have sort of ideal types but about, not everyone's at the same stage in their career. Their motivation is different at different stages in their career. So some of the personas we had was like the super achiever, like the young civil servant that comes in and wants to do everything. We have like the embattled veteran who's been around, knows everything, and each of these people has a different role to play. Some of these people are sort of the guardians of the gate. If you can convince them, then you can convince the entire civil service. So you need to think about what the motivations are, whether those are material motivations, whether they're career development motivations, in order to figure out how to bring them on board. We also don't think of every individual as having all of those skills, but rather how we can get them to work in teams so that they can each bring those different sets of skills. So actually in the types of exercises that we do, we're asking people questions about what do you bring, but then also what do you expect other people to bring in your team? And we're asking managers as well how these competencies are in their teams, but in groups of people. So we very much reason at the team level. I think we're also trying to think not about all civil servants as these kind of fungible, units, but rather thinking about the difference between what is the core civil service, where you need the independence, you need to have perhaps a certain level of competency to do analytics, as opposed to perhaps more delivery roles. So if you look at the Irish civil service, they have 30,000 people which are in the core ministries, and they have 70,000 people which are in the broader public service, which are more service delivery. And they have different statutes. The broader public service is much more close to private law. contracts. So, and that's what we're trying to do with our recommendation as well, it's not about sort of belittling or reducing the benefits for civil servants, but it's making sure that the terms and conditions accompany the needs of what they have to deliver. And so, this will be different size, different types for different civil service, but having a core civil service that is perhaps more generalist with streams of experts, sort of a bit like what Dustin was explaining for the cyber experts in the United States. And then just on this government as a platform issue, I think that people are very afraid. They're afraid that for their jobs, they're afraid that they're going to become redundant, when in fact, we all use computers. We all are already augmented by technology. So this is nothing new. And so I like, again, the US example of trying to move from the low-value tasks to the high-value tasks, because that makes people more motivated. It makes them more productive. Perhaps it can make them better paid even. That's not beyond the pale to have a smaller civil service that's better paid because it has better skills and is therefore more productive. So let's think a bit more, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think there is room here where we can think about win-win situations, which then can bring on board people who perhaps are a bit reluctant. We talked earlier about unions. I don't think unions are necessarily against change. If we can show them that there's a value proposition for their members, they can also be brought on board. But this is why we have to have this reform approach that is more inclusive and not just top-down.
So from my side, I think, it's interesting because there's already plenty of platforms in Brazil. And Brazil, I'm a bit dated now, but, you look at different places in the country. So there's lots of states, at least, that are using smartphone technology to get feedback on service delivery. So we've worked on projects up in Ceará where we're using smartphones both to monitor health service delivery, but also whether people pay bribes. And that's giving us data to be able to feedback. Several governments ago down in Rio Grande do Sul, you had this e-government where the budget was basically determined by people who were feeding into the system. And I always wondered, how can they, when I was working on this, the question was, how can they actually navigate all these requests and come up with some of the long-term needs that they're going to need if they manage their budget through this, give your input to the governor type process. And so one of the things that I think about is the question of it's easy to put platforms up, but then how do you coordinate the platforms? This question of coordination, which is it's one of the fundamental roles of government, is coordinating all these things. And in some sense, technology is changing the nature of coordination and how it works. And it can easily get out of control. And then how do you adjust? How do you adapt? How do things, it becomes more organic in terms of what, things may go up, they may come down. I have no clue I know some of the things that we worked on when I was there are long gone, and new things perhaps have come in to replace. But I also think there is a question about, as we think about all the data that's out there, you alluded to some of this, the big data, the data analytics, this notion of service delivery in real time. So the example I like most is buses, right? So you have buses, I think of the buses in Rio, where they're always stuck somewhere, breaking down, or, they're for a variety of reasons. But you have buses with chips, you have people on the buses with chips. You could monitor by satellite how many people are on the buses, and you could turn them into real service delivery where once the bus is full, it doesn't have to stop anymore at all the other stops, right? You could turn it into a much more fluid thing. It's hard to do, but that requires a whole different level of capacity, several orders of magnitude of capacity more, and a removal of vested interests that is hard to do. And so figuring out how you alleviate some of those coordinating things. And then the points that Ed raises on this notion of reaching out. So again, one of the things we're thinking about, or I'm thinking about, is, so I have 2 teenagers, and they sit on their computers, my son, and he asks, for something. He wants to buy jeans or a sweatshirt, whatever, And when he does that, the computer pops up and said, you like this, you might like this. You like that, you might like this. For him, the world is something where everything just comes to him. So the notion, this notion of reaching out in government, how it reaches out, and this notion of fairness is taking on a whole new meaning. Now, Brazil is pretty good when it comes to fairness and equity relative to other countries. I mean, I know the Gini coefficient is still awful, but over time, there have been improvements, and at least you think about fairness, whereas there's a lot of countries that don't. But those aspects are going to take on more importance in my view. We find that they are more important to effective development, and we did a report, the World Development Report 2017, which is all about how do you get effective policy. It's called Governance in the Law, but it's really about effective policy. And that really showed that inclusion was the fundamental aspect. So getting agreement on policies, getting inclusion. So this notion of top-down, you know, a group of cabinet people sitting in an office, a smoke-filled room, deciding what policy is going to be, and then, you know, it does or does not happen. I think those days are rapidly disappearing, and so it's changing the whole nature of policymaking. And so platforms are going to be an important part of that, but thinking about what that means for the overall models of the civil service, what capacities are required, so everybody's hoovering up data scientists as fast as they can find them. But then how they get used, and then there's another side to the equation, which is all the stuff that relates, that's in the news very much right now, which relates to right to privacy, to invasion. So I don't know how familiar any of you are with the work that's going on in China, but all this work that they're doing on data, and they are now creating this citizen scorecard where they sort of categorize everything that every individual does. And if you have a good score, you have options, and if you have a bad score, you don't. And these options are serious things, like where you can send your kids to school and whether you can fly across the country. And so it's a new tool for social coercion, which fits well with that. It's not a judgment, but that's their choice, right? But it does have very strong implications for other aspects of governance. So not just state capacity, it changes the capacities for what can be done. So those things, we joke about it, it's Big Brother meets Big Data, and you get all sorts of interesting creations as a result. So there is a whole set of issues around the regulatory framework, the rights, et cetera. So I think platforms are part of the solution, but the capacities and the things we need to be thinking about, I'm thinking the dusty academics are working on some of this stuff. So, but anyway, it's very real. It's happening so fast that some of us who've been around for a while can't keep up. But you know, we need to be thinking about what it means, and clearly, as time passes, it might help us. As I think it was Ed said, as the pensioners move on, we still have that big load of pension reform to deal with. But in any event, so platforms, yes, but lots of other issues around them. Paulo?
Thank you very much.
I think so.
So thank you very much, Debbie. I would like to invite Chico, because we are going to do a very quick wrap up here and end this workshop. And no, stay there, please, where you are. There you are. Yes, this has all been choreographed beforehand.
Finally honed
Do you think?
coordination
Yeah.
and
Do you
choreography.
think? We think about every detail here. Now, to thank you very much. I would like Chico with this event was actually born at the Kramer Book Coffee Shop sometime the fall of 17.
I'm not surprised.
So I would like to offer Chico opportunity to say some final words, and then I will.
Well, basically, thank you for everybody for attending. Some of you crossed the ocean to come, others just the hemisphere. But the point is that we're trying to organize the problems in order to make them approachable in that moment that we're facing in Brazil. We chose basically 2-3 problems: budgeting, civil service, and strategic capacities, because these topics are not easily modeled, and they demand very high level inputs to be clarified And some of you here are partners in other initiatives that we are carrying on, like Martin in Oxford, the OECD friends, Jan and Edwin. And we try to combine also some of our expertise in the field, bringing people like George, Luis, but also we're very curious. The curiosity stuff for us is particularly important, especially with respect to the United States. Luis Alberto did his PhDs in lobbying in terms of the US, but it's very rare in Brazil when we compare countries using the US as a contrast in our policy domain. Civil service, Luis also mentioned that the history of our public administration until the 60s was very intertwined with the American history. So that's something we're trying to recover, and thanks to Dustin, also we could have a sense of what's going on here in personal and budgeting. So this is the beginning, at least from our side, from a more intensive dialogue that will flow on bilateral basis. Matthew, it's a pleasure knowing you. We hope to be in touch in terms of our school with your institution more frequently. And I'd like a particular thank to Paulo, because this would not be possible without his patience and responsiveness. Some things that happen in Brazil. Improvisation can be a good thing also. Otherwise, we would not do it.
Oh, yes.
We had to decide, Chico, we'll do it in 6 weeks. Do you think it's feasible? I think that, well, in 6 weeks, we have a chance. More than 6 weeks, we will not do it. So it's confusing. Debbie knows the country very well. We have to understand ourselves in order to establish a better relationship with the world. But I think we are more optimistic with respect to the future than the newspapers suggest. So thank you very much, Paulo.
Thank you very much, Chico. Thank you to ENAP. Thank you especially to the United Nations Development Program that supported this. Obviously to all of you who came from across the ocean, from Maryland and Virginia and other distant places. This would not have happened without Anya Prusa, who is taking pictures, our program associate, who helped us put this together, and contacting you all, with our interns, Carlene Rogers, who is finishing a period of very productive for us, and going across the pond to do her PhD in Cambridge, University of Cambridge in the UK. Andrew Allen, who stays with us for a while, and just recently arrived, April Real, who is our newest intern. Our colleagues that helped with this, the audiovisual people, etc. 2 observations just to finalize. I like very much this business of narrative. But I'm a journalist. I spent my life doing this. And I was the beneficiary of the patience and the competence of some civil service people in Brazil and here that had the patience to talk to me and explain to me what they were doing. Not when I needed to write a story for that next day newspaper. No, and I was serious about this, and he knows the guy that we end up, I end up working with him, the late Jim Ferrer, an American diplomat, was DCM in Brasilia in the late 70s, and later he became the head of a program, the Minerva program at the GW. And for many years, I went there to talk to the Minerva program was for civil servants in Brazil that came, do a semester here at the school at GW. And my role was to go there and say, guys, please engage with journalists. Tell them the story, but not when they need, it's not to write tomorrow. Explain to journalists what you do, because most people don't know. They don't know because you don't explain, and you have to. It's part of your job is to explain to the people through journalists what you do on behalf of the people. I find it very important, And I was the beneficiary of that, both here and in Brazil. And finally, to end in a lighter note, Luis, thank you very much for the story that you told about the World Cup. 58, I was 8. That happened exactly 60 years ago. The coach was Vicente Fiola. The player obviously was Garrincha. And do you know what was the score? Was 2-0. Brazil won and went on to play Sweden in the final, and we beat them 5-2. Now, where is the next World Cup starting in a couple of weeks? In Russia. Okay, so let's close on a positive, hopeful note. I have my kids. After that tragedy that happened in the Mineirão, the 7-1 thing, I retired from soccer. I grew up watching Pelé and Garrincha. I said, well, man, this is not right. You don't do this. And my kids now tell me, Dad, go back watching because they are good again. Apparently they are. Apparently I already got my yellow jersey out, all ready to, And maybe this is the year where in Russia, under the spirit of Garrincha, we will restore global international soccer order. And affirm who is really good at this. And maybe if we do this, this even could help. Because we are kind of sad in Brazil these days, right? And which is not a natural state for us. We are happy people. So maybe, but I thank you for reminding that, because that's an excellent story about Mané Garrincha. And one detail, a defender from Russia announced that week that he knew how Garrincha dribbled, he passed people. Was always the same thing. He faked going here and he would go there, which was exactly correct. The description was exact. Garrincha had only one dribble, and he passed this defender 11 times during that game. In the last one, the guy fell, woke up, and shook Garrincha's hand. So thank you for reminding me of that story. Thank you guys for being here, and we will produce a summary of all of this. We'll have an edited version of the proceedings on YouTube, and let's start thinking about other exercises, because I think I am on the Pollyanna side of things. So I believe we will find the way out of this mess, and thank you very much.